In this video, we're going to explore two of the last models in this unit for atomic structure. And those are going to be the Bohr model and also the wave mechanical model, which some people call the modern model because it's the one we use today. So our aim is to just evaluate what our current understanding of atomic structure is, and that's, in the scientific community today. We do have some homework to do, but we'll do that in class the next time I see you. It's going to be to read pages 1 through 5, answer questions 1 through 2, and 4 through 12 on pages 5 to 6. So I want you to answer these do now questions. You can do that mentally. You don't have to write it down, but pause the video, read the questions, and consider answers for each. So the Bohr model is the first model we'll discuss today, developed by Niels Bohr, and one of the things he was doing was that he was disturbing some elements with electricity. And he discovered that when you disturb elements with electricity, you can get them to release light of a really specific color and really specific brightness. So in other words, after the atoms were disturbed, the atoms would emit a really specific amount of energy every time. So I'm saying here that brightness and color of light correspond to energy. So he tried to explain this using a new atomic model, which had some of what Rutherford had suggested for the atoms' workings and shapes, but also had some differences as well. So one way that I like to organize this idea of Rutherford's model versus Bohr's model is just to look at some key points, both in Rutherford's and Bohr's models. So are the electrons in specific orbits in the Rutherford model? So my answer to that is definitely going to be no. So electrons in the Rutherford model are outside the nucleus, but they're not in specific orbits. They are sort of generally outside the nucleus, just flying around. Now, if you build from there, in the Rutherford model, if the electrons are not in specific orbits, then that means that they could not store a specific amount of energy. The electrons could absorb some energy and store some energy, that's certain. But if they're not in a specific place, if they can be anywhere, then that means they could also absorb, really any amount of energy. So it would be unspecific for sure. And if it can't store a specific amount of energy, it certainly cannot emit, and that is to release a specific amount of energy. And the experimental evidence I was just discussing, where you disturb an atom and it releases the same color and brightness of light each time, that experimental evidence would definitely suggest that the Rutherford model, the one I've just been discussing with the no answers, the Rutherford model doesn't match up with the experimental evidence because we're not being able to release specific colors of light if we can't emit specific energies. So no, this is not supported by experimental evidence. So what Bohr is going to do differently is he's going to say that electrons are in specific orbits. And that means that they also will be able to store specific amounts of energy, and then they would be able to release or emit specific amounts of energy. And that also means that when you disturb them with energy or with electricity, and those electrons absorb energy, they're going to absorb specific amounts of energy and release specific amounts of energy, so it's going to be giving off this very particular color every time. So that actually is what we do observe in experimental evidence. We see that elements do release the same color of light every time. Some details that you might use to support the view that Bohr's model is better is that it's supported by experimental evidence in that different elements glow with different colors. So this is what Bohr's model might look like. We have a couple of different orbits. We have orbit 1, which is close to the nucleus. We have orbit 2, which is just outside orbit 1, and there can be other orbits as well. One thing to pick up on, although we don't need specifics at the moment, is that there are different numbers of electrons in the orbits. This one right here seems to have 2, and this one outside has 8. We'll be learning a lot about how electrons get placed into those orbits this year. We have a nucleus just the same as we did with Rutherford, and that nucleus has protons, it has neutrons, and they're in the center in this tightly packed space. So my highlight points for this slide are that Bohr called these orbits. He numbered them. If you compare this electron to this electron, just be aware that this electron and that electron are going to have the same amount of energy. Between the two of them, they're going to have the same amount of energy. Same as these two electrons would have the same amount, and so would this one and that one. So those two electrons have the same amount of energy. I'm just saying basically that electrons in the same orbit have the same amount of energy. But if you compare this electron to this electron right here, those two are going to have different amounts of energy, and in fact, this one in the higher orbit will have more energy. That's a note that you should write down, which is that the higher the orbit, the more energy the electron has. And my last point is, and this is how Bohr started to explain his experimental evidence, which is that he thinks that what's happening is when the electrons are absorbing energy from that electricity that he's using to disturb the atom, he thinks that when the electron absorbs energy, maybe an electron like this guy, he absorbs the energy by jumping up to a higher energy level. And that's possible because this energy level has more energy than this one, so if this electron gains some energy, it makes sense that it might jump up to a higher energy level. And then, later on, when the electron's up here, it will naturally fall back down to the original level, but it'll have to release the energy that it absorbed in the process. And that's what he thinks is leading to that emission of color, that of specific energy and specific brightness that each element has. But we did learn that the model that Bohr produced in all of its specificity actually didn't work for every single element. And there was a new model that was developed after Bohr's. And the model that I'm going to discuss on this slide is that model. And it's actually the model that we still use today, which is why a lot of people will refer to this model simply as the modern model. But other people will refer to it as the wave mechanical model, and two different names for the same thing. So basically, we're going to keep a lot of what Bohr was talking about. We still have this nucleus, tightly packed, it's dense, it has protons and neutrons. We still have electrons. Different numbers are in different places. But I tried to show that it's sort of a cloudy, murky, hazy place inside the electron cloud of this atom. Instead of being in clearly defined orbits, these electrons seem to be more in a cloud model, in these hazy, unspecific places. And the reason why we actually made our model less specific and more vague is because we found on close inspection that electrons were able to hide from experimenters when we were looking for them in the specific orbits. We found that when we looked for them in the specific orbits, there was only a small chance or a reasonably large chance that we would find them, and there was a small chance that we wouldn't find them where we were looking. And we think that's because electrons probably aren't like particles, which are, things that we understand in our world, we think that electrons maybe are so small that they act a little bit like waves. They act a little bit like energy themselves. And so they can move and they can be in more than one place at the same time. It's not something that's going to make sense to it, in a human world. But electrons maybe are somewhat like particles, but also maybe they're somewhat like energy. And that's why we call it the wave mechanical model. The word mechanical is referring to thinking of the electron as a particle, and then wave is referring to thinking about the electron more as energy. So highlights that you need to remember for this model is that the wave mechanical model was a result of the contributions of many scientists over many years. So we're not going to call it any name that's after one specific person. And it's actually the one that we use today. So also, electrons, we don't say they exist in orbits anymore. That's a word that we would use for the Bohr model. But we would say that they exist in orbitals. And the orbital is like an orbit, but it's less it's less specific, and it's in a hazier region. The actual vocab words that you would see on a test that describe that are that the electrons are going to be in regions of high probability. But that just means that it's, you don't necessarily know where they are. They're sometimes here, sometimes not. And that's what we mean by probability. When you look at this whole thing, this whole gray area, we would call that the electron cloud. And there's actually another vocab word here that I think is nice for you to have. It's called a kernel. And the kernel is basically all of the entire atom except for the very last orbital. So right here, these 8 electrons in this very last orbital, basically forget these. These have a different name. But these 2 electrons right here, any of the electrons underneath the outermost, and also all the protons and all the neutrons, so everything I'm circling right here, that is called the kernel. And then the area outside the kernel has a different name, which we'll get to later. So pause the video now, copy down the table in this para. You don't need to answer them. We'll go over them in class tomorrow. And you also should copy down these 4 summary questions. You don't need to copy down every single answer choice unless you want to. But you could copy down just the 4 questions, and then we'll answer them in class tomorrow.